Hi there, this is Bonnie and I'll be showing you how to do the satin stitch. The satin stitch is one of the most popular embroidery stitches. It's used as a fill stitch to cover the fabric completely. Traditionally, this stitch is done with only a single strand of embroidery floss. You can see an example of that here in the purple square and the green circle. Notice that the thread lays flatter and smoother against the fabric. It has a more delicate look. However, in examples of more modern embroidery, we've seen stitchers use multiple strands of floss and even up to 6 full strands. As always, we don't believe there's a right or wrong way to do things, and we encourage you to use as many strands as you'd like, depending on the look you're going for. Just remember that the more strands you use, the higher the pile of stitches will be. Also, more strands result in more texture. In the examples here, you can see the difference between a single strand on the left half of the purple square and 2 strands on the right half of the purple square. The orange square is stitched with 4 strands, and the turquoise square is stitched with a size 8 pearl cotton, which creates a lot of texture. A few other things to keep in mind when using the satin stitch are that you can choose to pad the stitches below to add some height. Even stitching a simple outline of the shape you plan to embroider will create some padding. We recommend using a split stitch to outline the shape because it creates a more even line as far as the height of the stitches go. In the purple and orange squares, I use the split stitch to trace around the outside of the shape first. Since the pearl cotton is harder to split, I used an outline stitch instead of the split stitch in the turquoise example. If you choose not to stitch an outline for your shape before doing the satin stitch, it's a good idea to at least draw in the shape first. The green example shows the bottom half with the stitched outline, while the top is done with just the drawn line. The satin stitch sits flatter on the fabric here. If you need support with the split or outline stitches, please check out our videos where Hannah walks you through those. You'll notice that the green circle is embroidered with the stitches both done where the stitches are all going in the same direction, and then also with them fanning out. So let's get started. You'll need your threaded needle, knot at the end. I'm stitching this curved rectangular shape with 3 strands of floss. This part has been outlined with a split stitch, and the rest will be done without it. I've also chosen a tightly woven fabric because it provides more stability for the satin stitch where the tension is super important. Please keep in mind that the stitches should remain shorter. A max stitch length of about 1/2 inch is probably a good rule of thumb. I'm going to begin with my first stitch in the center and work 1/2 at a time. So from the center out on either side. This is particularly important when you're working with some symmetrical shapes. So I'm going to come up from the back so that my knot's right up against the back side of the fabric. And then I'm going to go right next to that first guide. Now you can either stitch your guidelines or draw your guidelines. Now you'll notice that the thread has twisted slightly. So what you can do is use what they call a laying tool. Whenever you're stitching the satin stitch with multiple strands, this will help lay your stitches flatter against the fabric. So my next stitch comes just next to the previous one. You don't have to use the laying tool if it's not super important to you to have your stitches nice and flat, because you might like that texture, and that's okay too. You do whatever works for you. If you've watched our other videos, you've probably noticed that Hannah will often demonstrate how you can sew a stitch as well to save time. Now, because the satin stitch is a very precise stitch, you have to make sure that the stitches are laying right next to each other. I would recommend the poke and pull method for the satin stitch. You'll notice that my stitches are going just outside of the outline. If your strands are starting to twist as you're stitching, you can just let that dangle below and it will untwist itself. So I'll probably do 2 more stitches just to cover up that outline. Okay. Now at this point, I don't have a lot of thread left. If you had a longer strand still remaining with your working thread, you could just go underneath the stitches you just made to get back to the other side. But I'm going to tie off and then we'll come back and finish the curved part of the shape. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and work on the other half. Again, you'll start right next to the stitch, the last stitch. And I'm going to begin to fan this out to work the curve. So at the top half of the curve, I'll maybe be just a little bit away from that last stitch. At the bottom half, I'm going to be right next to it, possibly even right into the same hole, so that it starts to fan out. You don't want to leave so much of a gap at the top that you get little spaces, but it's definitely a little more space at the top and tighter at the bottom of the curve. I'm going to fit 1 more stitch in here. I'm going to tie off in the back. And then weave the tail underneath. This one got a little sloppy in the back, but you can see for the most part, the back looks almost exactly like the front. I could have hidden the knots a little better underneath, but this is a good stitch to use for things like if you're embroidering on tulle, where you want the front and the back to look the same, or at least the back to be neater. But there you have it, the satin stitch. It's a tricky one to get the hang of, but it's definitely a good one to know. Happy stitching!